The Super Nintendo, one of my favorite consoles of all time, and the first home console that I ever had. Now this one has seen some better days, and it's dirty and it needs work. But I have a feeling when we give it the rocker gaming treatment, do some restorations, do some mods, this console is going to look great and be ready to game all over again. Before we get started, I want to thank PCBWay for sponsoring this episode. PCBWay does PCB manufacturing and PCB assembly services. Whether you have a small order that's just a few boards, or major scale manufacturing, PCBWay can help you. PCBWay has helped me with many of my own projects, including some prototyping, PCB assembly services, and other small scale manufacturing. If you're interested in finding out more about PCBWay, check the link in the description below. Once again, I want to thank PCBWay for their help with the LED rings and sponsoring this episode. With my game bit in hand and Phillips head screwdriver, it's time to rip this thing open. The SNES Junior was released in 1997, which means we've got over 20 years of grime and other buildup sitting in that card slot. So I always like to do some general maintenance and really get that thing looking nice and clean. Contact cleaner and a toothbrush goes a really long way to making those pins nice and shiny all over again. Being a later revision to the Super Nintendo family, Nintendo made certain cuts to this system. Most notably, they cut out both the S video and RGB video that was native to the Super Nintendo system. So what I'm going to do is install a RGB amp. This is the Voltar amp, and it's going to be able to help us restore both RGB and S video. I personally find this kit to be of very high quality, easy to install, and most importantly, the picture looks absolutely fantastic with it. Installation's an absolute breeze and really doesn't take too much. Just remember to use good soldering technique and plenty of flux. But for now, let's go ahead and get this board installed to the video out. Installing the RGB and C-Sync lines are probably the most difficult part of this mod. Just remember to go ahead and pre-tin all your wires, get them tacked in with your soldering iron, and then go back over everything and make your final joints. If you use this technique, I think you're going to find that doing this part of the mod is significantly easier. While we've been doing all the soldering, the actual shell itself has been sitting in a soapy hot water bath that I just used a little bit of Dawn soap and a soft bristle brush to get all the dirt and grime off the console. Anything that's residual after that point, I use a magic eraser for, but the trick when using a magic eraser is to use a very light touch. With the RGB amp all complete, I'm going to turn my attention to the cart slot, and what I'm going to do is cut out the tabs here to make this region free. I've got a huge collection of Japanese SNES games, and I certainly want the ability to play those with relative ease. So just cutting those tabs off with a pair of flush cuts, and then sanding them down with a file is going to make it look really clean, and give me the ability to play both US and Japanese Super Nintendo games. So I got a suggestion from my buddy Linu to go ahead and create some custom casted buttons for the case of the Super Nintendo. And I couldn't help but think that that was an absolutely fantastic idea. And let's be honest, custom casted buttons is something that we've never really seen before, and so I took the opportunity to go ahead and do that myself. Now I will say that this mold that I made is extremely crude, and if I were able to do it again, I would love to make a whole bunch of changes to it. But for purposes of this mod, it worked out just fine. So I wanted to go for a super transparent purple. At least that's my goal. So to do that, I'm going to use epoxy resin. Now, I haven't been using epoxy as much recently. I've been trying to get more into urethane and using more urethane resin. But I wanted to get these as clear as possible and make them as transparent as possible. And really the easiest way to do it is with epoxy. But what I will tell you is if you try this yourself, I'd probably recommend the urethane route. The only problem with epoxy is it's incredibly brittle, and we're going to figure out exactly how brittle it is a little bit later on in the video. But for now, let's continue casting. So with all the buttons cast, next I want to turn my attention to doing an LED mod. Now typically when you end up seeing an LED mod on a SNES Junior, it'll look something like this. And let's be extremely clear, that looks absolutely fantastic. But my thought is, hey, if there's an opportunity not to mod or drill the original case, let's do that. Because let's be honest, we've got clear buttons, so I think we can shine some LEDs through them. So to do that, I'm going to use the SPE1 Bluetooth LED driver to go ahead and drive some individually addressable LEDs. Now the crazy thing is I only need to drive about 3 LEDs, but I do want the opportunity to change the color to whatever color I want the LEDs to be, as well as turn them off if I so choose. Installing this thing's an absolute breeze, and I'm just going to pull 5 volts and ground from the 7805 regulator and take it to the stripped down SPE110 Bluetooth LED controller. So you guys might recall earlier how I mentioned that using epoxy was a mistake, and the reason why is it's extremely brittle. So what I came to realize is getting the actual clips that hold down the buttons perfect was very difficult, and I ended up breaking one of the legs. Now in the grand scheme of things, it didn't make a difference for this project, but it's just something to keep in mind. From there, I just took some hot glue and hot glued the LEDs to the actual casted buttons. Now the one thing that is a little strange is, since the epoxy was so slick, I ended up having to rough it up with a little bit of a file. You could use sandpaper or whatever, but that helped get better adhesion between the hot glue to get it to stick to the LEDs and the casted buttons. But with all that done, the hard work's out of the way, just time to reassemble this bad boy, get it put together, and do some testing. So natively, this console only supported composite video. With the Voltar RGB kit, we now support RGB, and this is what the console looks like outputting RGB through the FrameMeister. As you can see, we got some absolutely razor sharp pixels. The console looks incredible. Well, we know that the video output looks awesome, but how about the outside of that console? Let's take a look. As you can see, this console cleaned up really nicely, and those casted buttons look absolutely fantastic. But let's be honest, we got to turn this console on because that's when it really shines. So as previously mentioned, we use the SPE110 wireless Bluetooth LED controller, And the beauty of this thing is there are tons of preset options, color patterns, fades, breathing, all kinds of different LED patterns that we can choose from at will and choose whatever we think looks the best. On top of that, if I really wanted to, I could turn this feature off completely. So if the LEDs ever get to the point where they might be annoying or I don't want them, I can always turn them off. For me, I'm kind of a simple guy and I like to keep things pretty simple. And I think I'm going to go ahead and stick with a nice kind of, purplish hue to kind of, accompany the initial color of the buttons. Overall, I'm super happy with the way this console turned out, and I think the casted buttons are a really nice touch on top of the other mods that were done. But let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Do you like the way the console turned out? If you enjoyed this video and want to check out some other Super Nintendo mods, check out the linked video in the description above. I want to thank you guys very much for watching. Please give me a comment, a like, and a subscribe, and I'll catch you guys for the next one here soon.